Hello, this is the Right Dose. This is Mike. It's Monday. I hope everybody is having a wonderful day. Today, I'm going to talk about campaign finance reform. There is a ton of money in politics, and I'm pretty sure everybody I've ever talked to about this says it's out of control. It costs like $1 billion plus to be a president nowadays. And the question, of course, always is, what do we do about it, right? Is the answer a more progressive, more government intervention? Is the answer a more libertarian approach? Do we need to get rid of all these regulations? Is it somewhere in the middle? Let's break it down. Let's take you back. Let's talk about where we are today and, of course, how we got there. So we got to go actually all the way back to 1791. At the time, this is when the first Bank of the United States is chartered. And this is really urged by the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Alexander Hamilton. Of course, there's opposition to this from, at the time, we're talking about the Democrat-Republican Party, and we're talking about the Jeffersonians, of course. And then if we move forward to 1828, we have the election of Andrew Jackson as president, and he was convinced that the bank was not just unconstitutional, but he really thought that it presented a dire threat to our liberty. During his whole first term, he really tried to take down the bank, huge fights with Congress. What was interesting was that in his reelection, in his year of his reelection, the Congress tried to actually recharter the bank, thinking there's no way that Jackson would veto it, and he absolutely did. And essentially, one of the main reasons he said he did is he just saw the open involvement in the presidential campaign from the bank, and it just really showed him the inherent corruption. Now from here, we got to jump all the way forward to 1893, and we got to look at one of the most devastating economic collapses in history that brings in Governor McKinley really to the national stage, right? And the Republicans they raised like $4 million, and they spent that on 200 million pamphlets, and McKinley crushed that election. Same approach, 1900, they millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars. They sent out 100 million plus campaign documents, millions and millions of postcards, written inserts, and they put like 5,000 weekly newspaper ads out there. So now what happened at this point is Teddy Roosevelt comes in 1904, right? And in that election, the Democrat Alton Parker really alleged that corporations funded Teddy getting into that position. And Teddy was adamant that that didn't happen. Come to find out years later, it actually did. What he did in response to this is in 1905, he kind of pushed Congress to actually take on a bill that had come earlier from a Republican in New Hampshire, Chandler, one of the senators. And this actually brought about the Tillman Act of 1907. The Tillman Act of 1907 really brought us the very first regulations to campaign finance. And what it did is it banned corporations from expending money from their treasuries to influence elections, right? This was the first time that campaign contributions were being recognized as a kind of a partly protected under the First Amendment. Now, from here, let me take a step back. The Tillman Act, which does remain in effect today, it has some major flaws, right? There are loopholes. Anything of value, corporations continued to donate things like office space, typewriters, travel to members of Congress, seemingly just working around the Tillman Act. So then what happened is the Hatch Act was passed in 1939. And this was, again, trying to limit certain political activities of federal employees. You keeping along with all these regulations we're passing? And then essentially it didn't work, right? So labor unions started to get very involved. It may have slightly stopped the corporations, but labor unions just got huge and got very involved in campaign activities, and they essentially ignored the Hatch Act, or they felt it didn't apply to them. And during this, a couple years later, right, now the first PAC forms. Right, so now we have laws. We have all these election laws. Corporations, unions are trying to prevent donations, and so of course, the powerful find a way to get around it, and they create the first PAC. And it was actually created by Congress of Industrialized Organizations, the CIO, and it was a committee to reelect FDR. So the very first PAC was put in place to elect a Democrat. Interesting. All right. Now, 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act forbade unions to contribute to political campaigns. All right, so that was the next step. Okay, now we jump to 1971, and this is where we really start to get the major election laws, right? Because this is where we get the creation of the FEC. So in 1971, we get the Federal Election Campaign Act, and the Federal Election Campaign Act went through multiple years of cases. The first version of the act, just to give you an example, after 1972 election, the Congress referred 7,000 cases to the Department of Justice, and the Comptroller General referred about 100 cases, and only 5 were litigated. 5, right? So 7,000 cases to the Department of Justice, and the Comptroller General referred about 100 cases to Justice. 5 were litigated. 7,100 cases, 5 were litigated. 1974, we get more amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971. These amendments, they basically they didn't really work, to be honest with you, because essentially right after the 1974 amendments, we have Buckley versus Valeo, and key provisions of the 1974 amendments were immediately challenged unconstitutional. And then so in response to the Supreme Court decision, we got more amendments in 1976. Now, these ones, what these did is that they included provisions that limited the scope of PAC fundraising by corporations and labor organizations. But what happened is that they put these significant restrictions on the PAC solicitations, like who could solicit the money, started to get very convoluted. 1979, we get more amendments that they build upon the 1976 and then the 1978 elections. Oh my goodness, a lot of amendments, lots of regulation, of course, right? Then in 1980, we had provisions to make it easier. This is so much. All right, now, this one I found interesting. So 527s, right? A 527, this is kind of where like the super PACs all come about. It actually started in 1974. That's when the IRS really kind of designated that classification. Now, the key line of the 527s is that basically, so 527s maintain their nonprofit status according to IRS rules, IRS rules through influencing the selection, nomination, election, or appointment of candidates for a local, state, or public office, here's the key, without expressly advocating the election or defeat of said candidates. Okay? Now, what happens here? 527, we have our first major 527 that gets involved in a presidential campaign, actually in the primaries. In 2000, Republicans for Clean Air, it's a 527. 2 backers of George W. Bush heavily goes after John McCain in the primaries. So what do you think happens from that? Shockingly, do we get legislation from McCain? We do. 2002, we get the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which was also known as the McCain-Feingold Act. And this one was arguably, by some people, one of the most important most important acts that have come about recently, because what it did is it put a ban on soft money, right? So soft money is like contributions that don't go directly to a candidate, which was one of the main ways that campaign finance was, kind of being gone around. So that was the McCain-Feingold Act, 2002. Now, from here, what you see also is the media getting heavily involved in politics, right? So first, the government steps in, tries to stop the corporations. The government steps in, tries to stop the unions. The government tries to step in and make sure that the money is coming only in specific ways. And so everywhere you see the government moving, the players continue to figure out where do we go next, right? And so the media becomes extremely influential because, of course, the media decides who they cover, right? The media has an ideological basis, right? They simplify issues based on that ideological basis. They perpetuate character-based scripting. I think we've seen that a lot. Over half of America, according to Pew, I think it's over 60%, gets their information from Facebook, from social media. And we know that social media players use algorithms to show you exactly what they want or to design what they want you to see. So all of this now brings us to kind of where we are today with Citizens United. Now, interestingly enough, it started because the FEC got a complaint from Fahrenheit 9/11 from Citizens United, right? Because even though Fahrenheit 9/11 was a movie, but essentially what they were arguing was, oh, I got to take one step back, right? One of the really interesting things about the McCain-Feingold Act was that, I'm going to read this right now. So it distinguishes a new form of campaign advertising called electioneering communication, defined as an ad that airs 60 days before a general election and 30 days before a primary, right? So essentially what it did is it really kind of limited when you could put the advertisements with specific candidates on the air. And then when we come back to this case of the Citizens United complaining to the FCC about Fahrenheit 9/11, essentially what they were saying is, if you take a look at it, it was airing 30 days before the RNC in New York and 60 days before the election on November 3rd. And there's a lot of really negative criticism in that about George Bush. But the FCC dismissed the complaint. Well, interestingly enough, that complaint really is what led to the Citizens United decision, right? Because now Citizens United puts out Hillary's America, and Citizens United has to fight this case, right? Is this political free speech? Now, the case, I'm not going to go through the entire SCOTUS case, but it was a very close decision, right? It was 5-4 decision. It was Kennedy wrote the decision, and it was very narrow. And essentially, they just said in this particular case, narrowly, right, that this is just free speech. They can do this. They can put this movie out there. Now, what was great in my view is that Roberts then got the SCOTUS to hear the case again and expanded it so it wasn't narrowly. And essentially, that's where we get that concept today that money is speech, right? Now, something I just wanted to kind of mention, a couple of things that I'm going to just give you my final thoughts here. So in 2012, 3.6% of the top 100 donations into super PACs, right? 3.6% of the people donated 80% of the funds. So here's kind of my take on all this. I get the problem. I get the concern. Get the idea that we don't necessarily want the all-powerful to control everything. But the bottom line is we do have a right to our speech. And as we can see from all these laws, all these regulations, they haven't really done what they've intended to do. In fact, nothing has really changed. We could probably say money influences politics today more than it did back then. And the truth is we can't see where any of it is coming from, right? So I think if we really think about what's the right answer here, the right answer is transparency. Nobody should be limited in where they put their money and how they use their speech. But don't you want to see it? If a candidate is going to take all of their money from one specific donor, don't you want to know it? Right? So that's my take on this. I also have found that generally speaking, most people or corporations are putting their money behind candidates they agree with. We pretty much have two major parties in this country. A lot of people believe with Republican conservative ideals. A lot of people believe in Democrat, I hate to say liberal, progressive ideals. And there's corporations that stand behind those people for multitudes of reasons. I don't see why we should prevent them from putting their money into it. Isn't it on us to understand what we're reading, what we're seeing, to go deeper, right? That's my kind of end thought on this, is that at the end of the day, we're the ones that have to decide who we're going to vote for, right? it doesn't matter what's bombarded at us. We can see an ad on TV and understand it's an ad, but I'd like to know who's pushing that ad. I'd like that to be a little bit clearer. So I think the best thing we could do is probably pull it all down and really try to create some type of simple, transparent disclosure system, which we pretty much already have. If you have to file as a PAC, if you have to, any type of IRS documentation, all that's going to be public record. So as long as things are done legally and elections are keeping track of the money they're receiving, which they have to do, we're going to know. And again, the only way that somebody's going to be able to go around this is by breaking the law anyway. So let's make the laws simple so it benefits the little guy a little bit more, as opposed to benefiting the powerful that can get around the laws. Those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think.